I'm Metta Spencer. Today we're going to go to Washington, D.C., and I'm going to have a wonderful opportunity to interview somebody who's, I think, going to change the discourse in Canada about the safety of nuclear power. If anybody should know what works and what's dangerous, this man is. His name is Gregory Jaczko, and he was in charge of the Nuclear Regulatory Commission in the US, which is in charge of making sure that everything runs safely in the nuclear power industry. Well, you can tell a lot from the title of the book that he published a couple of years ago. It's called The Confessions of a Rogue Nuclear Regulator. And when I read that book, I was simply bowled over because I found it more than compelling, extremely interesting and important. And so I've been chasing this guy ever since. Don't tell him how much I've been pursuing him, because I really wanted a conversation with him, and we're going to have it today. Hello, Gregory Jaczko.
Hi, it's great to be here.
It's wonderful to see you, and I really want to know all the secrets and give me the lowdown on what it's like to be in charge of the American nuclear power plants. And not only that, I mean, you had to help the rest of the world too, didn't you? You were in charge when the Fukushima disaster occurred, and you went over there and tried to pitch in and help, right?
Yeah, that was something I never anticipated in my job description, was dealing with a nuclear accident in Japan. But I didn't spend that much time in Japan, but we did have a team of experts from the NRC who went over there and almost embedded themselves within the government structure and really helped Japan finally recover from the accident. And I was busy keeping track of things here in the U.S. and dealing with Congress and the U.S. government as we planned what to do to help respond to that accident. So it was certainly something I never expected to happen, and something that I was never really planning to do. And so it was a very interesting time to be the head of the Nuclear Regulatory Commission.
Absolutely. Well, look, let's start at the beginning, where you get appointed to this job. You'd already been in the organization in some capacity. And the thing that comes through in your book is how political everything is, influenced by political issues and lobbyists and so on. So, and you got appointed in the Obama administration, right? Mm-hmm. And you had a pal in Reed. Right? Mm-hmm. Okay, tell me about it. I really would also like to hear this comment that you report about Rahm and Emanuel.
that was the story that got me a book published. So book publisher, but so I actually was appointed to. I was originally appointed as a member of. It's a 5-member commission that sets the policy for nuclear safety in the United States, the Nuclear Regulatory Commission. And I was originally appointed as a Democratic member to the commission. The commission is roughly split evenly between Republicans and Democrats, although that changes depending on who the president is. It can go up to one more of one party. But I was originally appointed to the commission in 2005 under George Bush then, and then served as a commissioner for about 4 years, until President Obama was elected, and then he appointed me chairman of the agency, which is both chairman of the commission and then is essentially the chief executive officer for the agency as a whole, which at the time I was in charge was close to 4,000 people, about 3,900 people at its peak. So a fairly large organization with really one mission, which was to protect public health and safety from the use of nuclear materials, primarily in nuclear power plants, but also some of the nuclear materials that are used in medical applications or industrial uses and things like that. So it has a fairly broad mission around all of those nuclear safety issues. But it, because of, as I talk about in the book, I started my career in politics in working for Ed Markey, who's now a senator from Massachusetts. And he introduced me really to his work on dealing with nuclear safety and the Nuclear Regulatory Commission oversight, and so I got familiar with the
Sorry,
agency.
wait, I'm interested in Marky. He's had a wonderful career. I'm trying to figure out now what was his role. He was then a congressman, and now he's a senator. And he's gone back years and years as concerned about nuclear issues. In what way was he responsible for the NRC?
Oh, well, he had a long history of doing oversight. He sat on the what was then the Commerce Committee in the House of Representatives. And that committee has jurisdiction over the Nuclear Regulatory Commission. So he had for a long time been very involved in oversight over the agency. And his efforts go way back to a battle over the Seabrook nuclear power plant in New Hampshire, which was near his district in Massachusetts when he was first elected to the House of Representatives. So he gave me my first job in Washington, and introduced me to the agency through his oversight work, and that's how I got familiar. But it gave me a reputation as being very critical of the industry, because I worked for Ed Markey, who was very critical of the industry. And then after about a year working for him, I got a job working for Harry Reid, who was then a Nevada senator and was strongly opposed to the building of the nuclear waste repository in the state of Nevada. And so I did a lot of, I did his work on that issue to fight the Yucca Mountain repository. And so I had two industry strikes against me. I had worked for one of the chief industry critics in the Congress, and then I worked for the chief opponent of the Yucca Mountain repository. So there was a lot of skepticism about me going to the Nuclear Regulatory Commission, which, generally had a history of, in recent years, of being fairly well controlled by the industry in terms of the people that were appointed to the commission. It's a political process in the United States, so the commissioners are appointed by the president and then required to be confirmed by the Senate. So that involves, then it introduces an element of politics into the selection of those commissioners. But through some wheeling and dealing by Senator Reid, I was able to get a spot as a commissioner. And then when President Obama took office, there was further efforts behind the scenes by Senator Reid, and then
I can't help laughing in anticipation because I've read this story.
Yeah, so it was actually a long effort a relatively long effort by Senator Reid to have President Obama nominate me as chairman. And I was not a traditional choice because I didn't really have ties to the industry generally, and not necessarily in a pro-industry, anti-industry sense, but typically chairman of the agency had been people, perhaps attorneys or other individuals, or often individuals from research institutions that deal with nuclear issues, some former military officials. And there was a lot of opposition from the industry because they were concerned, because they viewed me as someone who was very focused on safety and potentially critical of the industry and some of the industry's performance. And certainly, I had not been critical of the industry per se, but I had been aggressive in promoting policies that I thought were appropriate for safety, and doing that as a commissioner. So with the chairmanship, you gain additional authority to set the agenda, to manage the staff, and do a number of things. So there was a lot of work behind the scenes, and finally Senator Reid was able to prevail, and he called me up and said, I talked to either the president or the chief of staff at the time, Rahm Emanuel, and the president's gonna nominate you as chairman. And I said, great. And he said, but you need to go over to the White House. Rahm Emanuel wants to talk to you. And then I thought, well, that's great. I look forward to that. I haven't been to the White House too many times, and so I went over very naive and wide-eyed about what that experience was going to be like, and I got a very characteristic Rahm Emanuel lashing. And
before he knew you at all, he gave. What do you remember? What he said? Because it was. Bracing.
Yeah, so I don't know if this is a family channel, but he said something to the
Cut
effect
loose
that
and let her rip.
yeah, something. I think the phrase I used in the book was that he called me a fucking asshole, and said that nobody liked me, and that the president was only making me chairman because Senator Reid asked him to do it, which in hindsight, of course, is just his way of trying to politically. President Obama was very supportive of nuclear power. I was looked at somebody who was not supportive of nuclear power, or not necessarily. I never viewed myself as antagonistic to nuclear power, but I was viewed my job as being a regulator. It was not my job to take a position one way or another about nuclear power as a policy goal, but rather to focus on how to do the mission of the agency, which was to regulate it. Whether that meant the survival of the industry or not was really not relevant to me. So that that was, I think, in many ways for the administration, a source of uncertainty, and they were also very focused and concerned about climate change at that time, and they viewed nuclear power, and I continue to believe erroneously, as a key element of a climate strategy. And so I think there was certainly within many people within the Obama administration belief that meant that the Nuclear Regulatory Commission had to be somewhat passive in doing its job. That point was made clear to me in my meeting at the White House, that they were not thrilled to have me in the position that I was in, but they were going to do it anyway, which inside, of course, is politically was really not astute, because if anything, it made me then recognize that my loyalties were to Senator Reid and not to the Obama administration, to the extent that they would have had any real ability to control the agency, which it's an independent agency that really isn't much anyway.
Yeah, it raises a question for me. To what extent would you say support for nuclear power is politicized in the sense of the left being one way and the right being the other? I mean, I'd never, in the US or even globally, would you say that in general, Republicans or conservatives are more pro-nuclear than Democrats, or not?
Yeah, it's an interesting kind of political cohort, the pro-nuclear cohort. I think in many ways the perception and then I'll talk about the United States because I know the United States politics better. I mean, in general, people associate, I think, Republicans with support of nuclear power and Democrats with opposition to nuclear power. The reality is that it's really generally mostly Republicans and mostly Democrats that are supportive of nuclear power, and you've got elements, in the Republican side, who are opposed to nuclear power typically for financial reasons, and you've got elements, I think, in the Democratic Party that are opposed to nuclear power because of safety concerns and things like that. But by and large, most of both parties in many ways, and maybe more so Republicans than Democrats, are supportive of nuclear power. But there is in essence, there's a governing majority, a bipartisan majority supportive of the technology in the United States.
Is that changing at all? The ratio of plus or minus?
It's probably growing on the Democratic side, largely because of concerns about climate change. Mm-hmm. And I think the industry has done a very, very good job of promoting itself, the nuclear industry, of promoting itself as a key solution to climate change. I think that's completely wrong. But I think they have done a good job endearing themselves with elements of the Democratic Party that are very interested and focused on climate change as the crucial issue that is, and have made this case relatively convincingly, but erroneously, that you cannot get major climate solutions without nuclear power as a component of that. And so I think that has really broadened support among Democrats for nuclear power who may otherwise have not been supportive.
I wonder if Bill Gates's recent book is going to tip public opinion significantly toward nuclear power.
He certainly had done a lot to promote it, although, to be quite candid, I think his recent divorce has probably undermined any effort that he would have made in that direction. There's a lot that's incorrect about what he's promoting and what many people are promoting when it comes to nuclear power today, in particular in this context of it being a climate solution. And as I typically say to people, if nuclear power is necessary to deal with climate change, then we will not solve climate change. I, in fact, think that that's not true. And therefore, I think we can solve climate change and, in fact, are on the way to doing that. And it's going to happen without nuclear.
Do you? Yeah. Well, that's a plus if you've reached that conclusion, because I've been losing sleep regularly. Yeah. Okay. I want to hear sort of the inside story of what it was like in the U.S. government and the kinds of pressures, political, because most of the pressure seems to have been political on you, that constrained your capacity to limit the safety hazards. But, I also, of course, have to think in terms of global public opinion. And what I want your thoughts about the role of WHO and the IAEA. The way I came across your name was by listening to this wonderful podcast called Nuclear Hot Seat. And you did a good interview with this woman. She also has done interviews with many other people, including a woman named Allison Cates, who ran something called the Independent WHO or something like that, a protest movement against the WHO, where she had worked for 16 or 18 years, saying that it was under the control of IAEA, which has its mandate is certainly a self-contradictory mandate because of the dual elements of the NPT. And so it certainly convinced me that globally public opinion is being hoodwinked into lack of awareness of things like the effects of Chernobyl and so on. So all of that came before I was aware of your book. So I kind of, just to let you know that I read your book within the context of this global, I think, illusion or delusion about the safety of nuclear power, which I'd already reached as a result of seeing some of the other things that had been, I think, in a way suppressed in terms of public information. I don't know. Now you can react to whether I'm off base or not. I mean, I could be very, very wrong.
It's always hard to say what the nuclear industry is, but it's a large segment of major, energy producing companies. In some cases, in some countries, they are government owned and government controlled. That in any energy company is always a very, very powerful industrial institution because of the important role that energy plays in our daily lives. And we cannot function without energy, without electricity. So these companies, no matter what, whether it's nuclear or oil and gas, or even today, the renewable industry, which is growing in its importance and influence, these companies always have tremendous influence. I would often go visit nuclear power plants as part of my job to regulate, and I would usually go with a few staff, and they would sit. And when I would go to a nuclear power plant, one of the things I'd want to do is address all the employees that would work at a plant who were available, and some plants, depending on how they work that, it could be up to several hundred people in a room. A typical nuclear power plant will employ hundreds of people, depending on the size, could be up to almost 1,000. And I would tell everybody to look out of the room, and there would be a few NRC staffers with me, and then hundreds of employees of the plant. And I reminded everyone that that's about the same ratio as the amount of people that overall work at the Nuclear Regulatory Commission compared to the overall size of the industry. So it's a very, very large industry. It has, it's a multi-billion-dollar industry that produces electricity, which is a vital resource for so many parts of our country. So it also employs a lot of people, which makes it a very, very potent political influencer, because there is nothing more valuable these days to a member of Congress or senator than jobs. And it's just always the case. I mean, this is the number one issue. If you want to try and influence a member, you threaten them with, jobs leaving or jobs coming, or you entice them with jobs coming to some, for some activity. And nuclear power has been very, very good at utilizing this kind of wedge. They, can employ large amount of people in an area that otherwise has no economic activity, and the jobs are good paying. So,
okay, but look, the people working, the employees there would not be unionized, right? They couldn't. They have no, or are they?
Yeah, many of them are unionized.
Are they? Okay,
Yeah.
because I was thinking, are they 100% enthusiastic about the work, or are some of them whispering to you that they have safety concerns themselves?
I would say it's both. I don't think those things are necessarily contradictory. My general experience is that most of the people who work at nuclear power plants are very dedicated professionals, very concerned about safety and trying to make sure that the plants operate safely. The reality is it's a complicated technology, and there's only so many things you can do to make sure that a nuclear power plant never has an accident. And I think that's where there starts to be this disconnect, is that in some cases, accidents are not necessarily going to be the fault of bad intended individuals, but simply the limitations of the technology. And I think that's where I tend to have the biggest problem, I think, with nuclear power, is that there is this perception, or perception has been created by the industry, that the technology is in many ways infallible. And of course, I saw firsthand how that's simply not true. And that was dealing with the nuclear accident that happened in Fukushima, Japan, in 2011. So that was really forced me to confront this reality that had in many ways always been a hypothetical. We did made a lot of efforts to regulate and ensure safety based on hypothetical accidents and things that could go wrong. And as I remind people, that's a hard thing to do, because the costs to address that are always real. The accidents may be hypothetical until they happen, but when you're trying to prevent them, those costs that industry has to bear are real. And that's a very powerful tool for them to go talk to a member of Congress and say, look, the NRC wants me to do all these things. It's going to cost, $1 million. And that means I'm going to have to raise the price of power. And that's going to affect all the ratepayers in your district that rely on this electricity. I may have to cut my workforce back by 5%. That's going to affect jobs. All for what? The chance that there might be an accident someday that, they can't even say for sure is going to happen.
Okay,
that's kind of the, yeah.
Suppose you had been really in charge of Fukushima, that you'd been the regulatory agency recommending fixing it. Now, after the fact, it's easy to say they shouldn't have put it where they did, and it wasn't done correctly, et cetera. But would you have caught that in time, and would you have been able to do anything about it because of the very reasons you've just given for why you couldn't do anything so easily in the U.S.?
Yeah, I mean, certainly, there's no way, from the United States, I could have done anything to, change the location and design.
But imagine you were in Japan.
Yeah, I mean, it's, the design decisions were made decades ago. And, I can imagine how these things work. It's very, very difficult to reverse those kind of longstanding decisions. The government's position is not as powerful as people, I think, often think. When you grant an entity like a nuclear power plant a license to operate, you are giving them an authority. And taking that authority away is very, very hard.
But we have in Canada done so. There's a plant called Gentilly in Quebec that was shut down. And I believe in California, there have been at least one, maybe other existing operational power plants that have been shut down for safety reasons or other reasons. So it has occurred.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, and what you'll find in most cases is, so there's two plants in California, two plant sites. One is Diablo Canyon, which is intending to shut down. The other is San Onofre, which was a plant that had an accident. So it was essentially shut down after the accident. And it's actually happened while I was chairman of the Nuclear Regulatory Commission. And, just to give you a little insight into what it's like to do that, the plant was shut down. They had an accident which required it to shut down. They released a small amount of radiation, and then the investigations began. And that's when we started to understand what had happened. And essentially what had happened was they built a new piece of equipment, a very large piece of equipment vital for the plant. And that piece of equipment is a barrier between the radiation environment and the outside environment. And that piece of equipment actually did not get reviewed by the Nuclear Regulatory Commission fully before it was installed. And they made, because of the way the requirements are written, they made a choice that they thought they didn't need to send it to the NRC for review. And so it's the kind of way that the system works. They got to make that choice. They then wound up having an accident because the design was faulty. And after the fact, then the NRC investigated and recognized they made the change without getting prior approval from the agency. And I do believe in that case, had the agency been able to review the design, we would have identified faults with it and problems with it that could have, you can never say for sure, but I think there was a greater likelihood that that design would never have been put in place and the problem may have been identified. Not guaranteed, but probably would have been.
What was the fault around the Diablo one?
So Diablo was purely an economic decision. The plant decided, the owners decided they no longer wanted to operate the plant, partially because of public opposition to the site. But it was largely an economic decision that they decided. There was no specific safety issue that the NRC said, you have to shut the plant down for. The other plant, San Onofre, the NRC then, because of this fault, this failure, the NRC then required things to happen before they could restart the plant. And I remember a particular meeting where I had with the owners of the plant. They came in, they said they were ready to start. They wanted to restart the plant. And I sat down with them and they presented a very nice presentation. And essentially what they said was they had some new computer models. These new computer models they thought would better predict what was going to happen. And so they could better control this piece of equipment, ensure that it didn't have another failure. And I said to them, that's kind of a simple question. I said to them, well, have you run these computer models with the old design? And did it predict the problem that you actually witnessed? And which is an obvious thing that you would want to do. It's a simple way to validate your computer models. And there was silence.
They didn't say that they had or hadn't run them.
They had not done it. Things have failed along the way that, someone should have asked that earlier, or they should have asked that themselves before they came in and made this presentation and said, hey, we're ready to go. And so they then backed off and said, we have more work to do. We'll come back later. And eventually they could never really come up with a plan that was cost effective to get the plant restarted without having to completely replace this component that they had just replaced. And it was a component that would have cost about $1 billion. So then they decided not to move forward. It was a failure on many fronts, really on the part of the company. But when you look back, like I said, I think the NRC had an opportunity to catch this. But because of the kinds of changes that the industry or the NRC has made over the years in response to industry pressure, the industry put in, or the agency put in authorities to do things like replace a major piece of equipment without getting prior approval. So that was a change to our regulations that had been made at some time, and it was a cost-saving measure for the industry. So the argument is, if it's the same equipment meets the same standards and the same set of requirements, then you can go ahead and replace that without necessarily getting it approved, even if it's a very, very large, vital piece of equipment. And, that's something that over the years, these are the kinds of ways that the industry over the years chips away at kind of the regulatory process. And so the NRC then had no authority really to go in and review that before, and they made it and they did it wrong. And as often is the case, it wound up hurting them, because not only did they release the radiation in the environment, although a small amount, it essentially led to the demise of the plant.
Yeah.
And so rather than, letting the regulators be another look at this and see, is this right? Have you done these calculations correctly? Is this going to be safe? they thought they could do it without that. And it turned out that that was wrong.
About the safety of reactors in earthquake areas. It seems to me there was one reactor in California that was supposedly situated too close to a fault line or something. What was that all about? That was 20 years ago, so I've forgotten.
Both, so the site in Southern California, San Onofre, and then more Northern California, Diablo Canyon, they're both near earthquake areas. So all plants in the United States actually have to look at earthquakes when they're designed to protect against earthquakes. And that's one of the challenges that, certainly from the Fukushima accident, we realize is we need to make sure we have those issues properly understood. The Diablo Canyon plant in particular had been going through a very extensive review as part of an effort to extend the license for the plant. The way that I look at the technology today is that, it is fundamentally a technology that has the potential for very serious accidents. And you can do many things to reduce the likelihood of those accidents, but you cannot eliminate it. There was always going to be, an earthquake we didn't find. There's going to be a fire hazard we didn't consider, a tsunami threat we didn't realize, or some other kind of fault or some action that an operator takes that wasn't planned that can lead to these kinds of accidents. And that's, for instance, what we saw in Chernobyl. It's what we saw at 3 Mile Island. It's what we saw at Fukushima. So, you can always look at these issues and try and fix them, but you can never fix all of them.
I have one that I don't know whether you can address, because I was in a conversation very briefly with a nuclear engineer kind of guy who turned against the industry the way you have, in a way. And he was saying that he's been talking to people about Canadian reactors, the CANDU stuff, and that and I may be wrong here. I think he said they have miles of pipes full of hydrogen. I don't know whether that's true. He says, pipes corrode, and if something happens to those, to get an explosion, it could be absolutely horrible. But I haven't ever heard anybody else talk about that. Does that ring any bells for you?
The CANDU. So I don't believe it's hydrogen in those plants. You have
something in there that he said was explosive.
Yeah, I don't think there's an explode. What you have is there's a lot of graphite, which is part of the kind of reactor system, and that graphite can burn. Graphite can burn relatively easily, and you do have many channels, and you have coolant. I believe it's a gaseous coolant that's used in that reactor type. But again, all these nuclear reactors are very, very complicated machines that are controlling a very, very dense energetic process, and which is the nuclear reaction. And so you have always this potential, in particular with the designs that we have in the United States, where you can fail to control that energy release or that energy that's being produced, and that's when you get accident. And it's a tremendous amount of energy. The thing that one of the statistics that I think is most fascinating about Fukushima is to think about what happened. And, all the nuclear material and the radiation is contained in this thing called the reactor pressure vessel. And it's a large, metal, basically cylinder with a big lid on top. And that lid is a big, big, heavy piece of steel, with bolts that are the size of, Arnold Schwarzenegger's legs. I mean, these are bolts that keep that secured to the top of that. Well, during the Fukushima accident, so there hydrogen was produced and hydrogen was released and led to explosions. Well, probably how that hydrogen was released was that the pressure inside that vessel grew so strong because the heat and the energy was not able to be removed in the normal way, that what it actually did was it lifted that massive lid up away from the vessel. So kind of the cap on top of that cylinder, that massive cylinder. And the way it did it was so strong that it actually stretched the steel bolts. So it didn't break them, it stretched them so that it could lift that enough and that pressure could be released. I mean, so the energy is tremendous that's inside of these reactors. And normally that energy is dissipated by, the process of cooling, and it's that cooling system, when it breaks down, that will lead to these accidents. And at that point, it's all kind of Mother Nature, because this radioactive process just happens naturally, and there's nothing you can do to stop it. All you can do is remove that energy and the heat. And so, whether it's an earthquake, whether it's a wildfire, whether it's, any number of different things that can trigger that, there are many, many ways for this process to go wrong. We largely say we think we've captured the most likely things that can go wrong, but there could always be something else. And that something else happens more likely than kind of it's supposed to.
I want to hear what's going on with the Yucca plant, where that stands now, or the Yucca disposal site, and what you think in general about burying the stuff versus leaving it at the site in tin cans or something.
Yeah, it's, I think, well, the first thing I always say when it comes to nuclear waste, first thing you have to do is stop making it. We can't keep complaining about the fact that we don't have a solution for the waste problem and continue to be making more of it. I think that often gets missed. And it's one of the things that I do regret never having said as chairman of the Nuclear Regulatory Commission. I said a lot of controversial things, but I never was willing to say that, because that would have been probably too controversial even for me. But that's the reality. That we really don't have a solution for this waste. And so, first thing we have to do is stop making it. That's step one. Beyond that, it is typically material that is in a solid form. So that gives you advantages when you want to try and figure out what to do to dispose of it. But the problem is that most of this waste is hazardous for a very long time, hundreds of thousands to a million years, which are just timeframes that are really incomprehensible from a safety system perspective, right? We can't design, we can't say we're going to have a government in 100,000 years that looks like the governments that we have, let alone, a planet that looks like the planet we have today in 100,000 years. So to sit here and try and pretend that we know what to do with nuclear waste over 100,000 years is foolish. I mean, it just really can't be done. So that has generally led to people to fall back on the idea that, well, since human systems can't be relied on for that kind of a time frame, we have to look to natural systems. So we need to find places underground where this material can be isolated by nature, basically, meaning you try and find stable geologic structures where you can put the material and it will not get out, because we generally know that those geologic features are stable over, hundreds of thousands to a million years. That's turned out not to be as easy as it sounds in practice or in principle, because aren't necessarily those kinds of systems, or we can be wrong about identifying. And so that's been the challenge, is trying to figure out where those places are. But even, for instance, when they were studying Yucca Mountain, there was all the computer models that were used to try and analyze the performance. And mind you, this was put in what was supposed to be a desert, because the number one enemy of nuclear waste long term is water, because it's a kind of a metal, and that will lead it to corrode and then eventually be transported out into the environment. Even in a place like Nevada, which is a desert, in this mountain where they were going to bury it over hundreds of thousands of years, you would get enough water in there to corrode the fuel, and it would eventually leak out into the environment. And this is, arguably one of the optimal places where you could do something like this. So, the reality is it's probably impossible to find a system that will contain this material. But for many, many years, that had been the preferred solution, because this was the kind of bury it and forget it. It's our, I think as humanity, it's our typical approach to most kind of environmental waste problems, which is we just want to put it somewhere where we don't have to think about it anymore. And that was the idea behind the U.S. Geologic Repository Program, was a bury it and forget it approach. And I think, as time goes on, I have come around more to the approach that what we really have to do is more of a sustained management approach, which is we take stewardship of the material, we maintain it, we monitor it, we put it in places where we can do that, and recognize that it is a burden, but it's a burden that we've created for, we did it to ourselves and we have to be responsible for it.
Okay.
And I think that, in some cases that means moving it from the communities where it is, because some communities are not well suited for that. In some cases, it might mean doing that. But again, that's a very difficult task, because the companies that produce this waste, they don't want to be responsible for the waste 2,000 years from now, or even 50 years from now, right? If they're not making electricity anymore at that nuclear power plant, they have no revenue. They have no way to pay for it. It's just a liability. And at some point, if that's all they're doing, they're going to declare bankruptcy, because that's not a business.
Yeah.
And this is where we get into challenges and problems with this material. It is a waste, and it needs to be dealt with. And it takes responsibility and stewardship to do that. Whether if we're lucky, we can find places underground, or that where we can isolate it. But I think that's proving to be a harder task than
Okay, let's talk about reprocessing.
Mm-hmm.
I've been in touch with Frank von Hippel, who's written
Mm-hmm.
a book recently about
Yeah.
urging us to be more worried about reprocessing than almost anything else, because he, as I am, comes largely out of the nuclear weapons angle,
Mm-hmm.
Not wanting proliferation of nuclear weapons, and anytime you produce isolated plutonium,
Mm-hmm.
you're going to have a bunch of people wanting to get hold of it
Mm-hmm.
for bad reasons. And as I understand it, there is an argument that you could do this breeder reactors, or you could do things that would reuse these elements, these waste
Mm-hmm.
products. And sort of, some people would say, burn it up, use it
Mm-hmm.
for good purposes, for additional nuclear power. And I guess the main argument against that is that you'd have to go through reprocessing.
Mm-hmm.
Do you want to talk about that, please? And also, is that relevant to the debate about the new proposals for small modular reactors?
Yeah, so reprocessing it's a form of the way to think about this is it's the fuel that comes out of a reactor starts as one metal, uranium primarily, goes into a nuclear reactor, and the nuclear reaction process happens, and it changes that uranium into a whole bunch of other things, some of which are bad for making energy, some of which are good for making energy. And so the idea is that if you can, separate the wheat from the chaff, so to speak, you can take this material and reuse it and make more nuclear fuel. And the process of doing that, that's called reprocessing. And essentially, you have to separate out these basically plutonium that can be used, as well as some of the uranium. There's a couple problems with that today. The first is that nuclear power is essentially flat or declining. Certainly in the United States, it's a declining energy source. So we have no need for all this additional nuclear fuel, because we likely will not have very many reactors running in several decades. Globally, nuclear power will likely also decline soon, as the U.S., which is the largest nation when it comes to nuclear power, its fleet starts to decline. So you really don't have a strong argument for making this fuel for reactors. There's also plenty of surplus uranium that already exists that does not need to be mined, that can be used. But again, there is mining activity involved in producing uranium for fuel. So one could argue that from a purely environmental perspective, there could be a benefit to trying to do this. But again, as nuclear is declining as an energy source, I think that's not going to be necessary. But then, of course, when you do this, you run the risk of you make this plutonium separate from all the other things, which means that somebody could steal it and use it to make nuclear weapons. And that really is the concern with reprocessing. So, today, I just don't find it necessary, because of the fact that nuclear is not going to be a growing technology. There's just no justification for doing it. And, the countries that do pursue programs like this, they do it largely because they may have limited uranium supplies, or they have intentions to covertly develop nuclear power program or nuclear weapons programs. And we've seen that happen in the past.
What about the small modular reactors? Weigh in on that one.
Yeah, so there's a number of different. Well, I should say that there's a thing out there called advanced reactors, which are what I call the unicorn reactors. They're the magical reactors that exist in all the wonderful literature about the virtues of nuclear power, but don't really exist in the real world. And of that, you have a number of reactors that are designed to deal with this problem of spent fuel by being able to use some of this material that you would reprocess and to use it and power new reactors. So, slightly different approach to nuclear power than what we have today. So the idea would be you have the reactors today, they produced all this fuel. Instead of having to dispose of it, we could put it in as a fuel source for this new generation of reactors. Well, these reactors are most likely not economically viable or commercially viable, anytime in the next 10 to 15 years at the earliest. Now, of these advanced reactors, there's a class of so-called small modular reactors, which are really just like the reactors we have today. But instead of kind of having one big reactor, you take that big reactor and you break it up into a bunch of little small reactors. And the reason for that is that large reactors today, they take 5 to 10 years at the earliest to build. They're very expensive. And so you have to borrow a lot of money, and that makes them even more expensive because you have to pay interest on all that money before you can ever generate any revenue. And that makes them challenging from a financial perspective. So if you could take that big reactor, break it up into little pieces that you could make in a factory, and then kind of get them all ready at one time, you might improve on that kind of economic perspective. But most of the small modular reactor designs are really the same as the big reactors we have today, so-called light water reactors, and would not really be involved in this process of utilizing spent fuel and burning spent fuel, so to speak. That's a slightly different class of reactors that people are trying to develop, basically to try and address all of the spent fuel that we've already created.
Okay, good. Thank you. Now let's talk about what has happened since you left your mighty position, your powerless mighty position.
Yeah, well, I think, probably the most interesting thing that's happened is really how quickly the nuclear industry in the United States has started to decline. I about a year after I left the Nuclear Regulatory Commission, I happened to give a talk, and I said that that nuclear was declining in the United States, and a lot of people lashed out at me and said that he's finally admitted he's anti-nuclear, and what I was simply stating was a matter of fact, which was all the nuclear power plants in the United States were licensed for a fixed number of years. At a certain point, those licenses would begin to expire. Some of them might be extended. But at some point, we have about 104. Well, we had 104 reactors when I started as chairman. Eventually, those reactors were going to start to shut down. And at that time, in 2013, we were only building 4 new reactors. So the math is pretty simple. You weren't replacing 104 reactors with 4 reactors. What has been shocking to me is how quickly that decline has accelerated. So today, there's 94 so reactors in operation. So 10 reactors have actually shut down in the decade or so since, or the 9 years since I left the Nuclear Regulatory Commission.
10 in the U.S. have shut down.
Yeah.
Where are they?
They're scattered throughout the country, various parts, some in the Midwest, some it's all over. And it's a combination of safety problems, economic issues, competitiveness from renewables, and also natural gas. But more and more so, it's lack of competitiveness with compared to renewable sources. So, I think what the industry is recognizing is that it is a declining industry. They're losing their share of electricity production. Of those 4 reactors that were under construction in 2013, 2 of them have actually been canceled because the projects were so far behind schedule, so far over budget. In fact, to the point that one of the senior executives involved in that project pled guilty to fraud charges about basically overestimating the project. So, you've got what were supposed to be 4 new reactors under construction has turned into 2 new reactors, and you've already lost 10. And clearly, the industry is not going to be expanding. It's only going to be contracting. And the good news is that we have alternatives now. I mean, clearly the one virtue that nuclear power has is that it does produce electricity without carbon emissions. It does not burn fossil fuels. And so when we're staring down the face of this climate catastrophe, you'd want to keep as many of these carbon-free electricity sources as you can. But what many analysts have shown, and what we're seeing in the marketplace, is in fact now we have replacements. Renewables have become so cheap, and again, cheaper faster than anybody really anticipated. And battery storage technology has gotten cheaper faster than anybody really predicted, to the point now where the obvious choice for not only replacing existing power plants, but for new power plants is really a renewable system with some type of battery storage. That is really where not only do we get the best environmental solution, but we get the best cost solution. And that's really an amazing achievement. And that's something that, I mean, it's something that the Obama administration deserves a lot of credit for. And previous administrations, the Congress deserves credit for that, for incentive programs that really stimulated the renewable industry. And it's actually worked far better than I think anyone really anticipated it ever would. I mean, the price declines have been tremendous. Some of that is due to China as well. China has gotten into the game of manufacturing solar panels and mining a lot of the materials. And, there are certainly downsides to that, but it is really staggering to see how this race really has played out over the last 9 years.
Except that I think the happy news that you give about to me happy, the decline of nuclear in the US, or the slowing down, is not matched everywhere equally. I think in certain other parts of the world, they're still on the bandwagon, more or less.
Well, I think there's, I would even argue the United States is on the bandwagon, but there's almost no country that is constructing nuclear power plants in large numbers other than China. And Europe is not doing it. Europe is building a handful of plants, and they're struggling mightily to build a handful of plants. The only really major source of nuclear construction right now is in China. And, I think I read an article recently indicating that even China now is rethinking that policy. But it's also important to put that in context. China is also the world leader in solar installations, I believe in wind installations, which dwarf their nuclear installations.
But also the leader in coal, unfortunately.
They are, and it's true, and but they're shifting their fuel source because they recognize that they have to. And so when people talk about nuclear is growing, it's really in China. But as I always say, China's building everything of everything. So you can't take lessons about the trend for this industry because of what's happening in China, because the demand there is so huge. And like I said, they are building vast amounts of these other carbon-free sources as well. And they've had some experiences recently with building new reactors. They have had problems. And so I think as a policy, they're recognizing, even in China, that this may not be a viable, fruitful path to deal with climate and moving away from these dirty fossil fuels. And so really beyond China, there are countries here and there that are building reactors, but we have about 450 reactors today. About a quarter of those are in the United States. And no other country, the closest country is France, which has 60 or 70 plants. I forget the number exactly, maybe as high as 80, but I don't think it's that high. And even in France, they're talking about switching over and decreasing their reliance on nuclear. And Europe is not, the UK is trying to build plants, but they're building, 1 or 2 plants. This is not a future technology anymore. And so, there's a lot of marketing hype around nuclear, that's for sure. The marketing hype is extremely high right now because the industry is dying and it knows that. And so, they're funding, studies, they're funding, think tanks, they're doing everything they can to try and get people to say we need nuclear power. And, in many ways, people are responding. They're saying we need nuclear power. The problem is the industry just can't deliver. And meanwhile, the renewable industry is delivering, globally and certainly in the United States, the bulk of new energy additions are renewables.
Yes, but you're moving from a very tiny percentage of the total amount of energy up to, I mean, you're going to have to explode with the growth of renewable energy. It is a challenge, even though you say it's true that they're growing very, very rapidly. Mm-hmm. Can they grow that rapidly? I mean, it would be astounding.
Yeah, I mean, right now, the current pace of renewable capacity additions, you probably have to double to get to, say, a 2035 goal of 100% carbon or net carbon. And right now, it's growing at about 2.5% per year. So it's actually it is effectively exploding. It's not probably exploding as fast as we need, but it is in fact happening. I mean, and it's happening all over Europe too. I mean, you look at many countries. I mean, you'd be surprised to know, for instance, Costa Rica. Costa Rica is 100% renewable powered. There are countries all over the world that are achieving these high levels of carbon-free energy generation. Norway is also a country that I believe has no or very minimal fossil fuels. Some of that is reliance on hydro expansion in Europe. I mean, offshore wind has been a huge driver for renewable generation in Europe. So in fact, it's actually, we are seeing explosive growth in renewable today. And 2020 was the first year at which renewable generation, so including traditional hydro or traditional renewables like hydro, actually counted for more electricity generation than nuclear and more electricity generation than coal. And that's a factor of both the renewables growing and coal declining. But it is it's actually a fairly large percentage, and there are parts of the country, the Midwest, where a significant portion of electricity comes from wind and renewable sources. And there are days when you see renewables accounting for upwards of 70% of electricity generation. Sometimes it's hard to realize you're in the middle of such a huge explosion when you're actually in it, but we're in it right now. And and thankfully, we have a Biden administration which is actively encouraging these kinds of policies or this kind of industrial expansion, as opposed to the Trump administration, which was doing its best to try and slow them down, although they were largely incompetent in doing that because the market forces are dictating what's happening right now. So that acceleration in the growth it's got its best chance of happening right now. And I think with
do you think it would help if there was a real effort to shut down the subsidies to the fossil fuels industries? Would if we cut off some of these pipelines quicker, would that speed up the development of the renewable energy?
Yeah, I think it. I certainly think it would. I mean, and I think more importantly, what I do think you have to do in the United States, the real issue is really the competition between renewables and natural gas. That's the future. If we don't do any proactive policy making, we will wind up with probably 80% renewables and about 20% natural gas. If we had done that maybe 20 years ago, that's probably a sustainable climate solution. It's not a sustainable climate solution today. So we have to get to 100%. So that's the challenge, is how do you kind of capture that 20%? But with the trajectory we're on, we can get to that 80% cost effectively. I mean, it's the cheapest way to get there. So it's really how you fill in that last 20%. And that probably means you need to do something to proactively make gas more expensive. So whether it's eliminating subsidies, whether it's taxing, whether it's doing something, or it's just direct policy requirements that say, you have to have 100% of your electricity from non-gas sources, carbon-free non-gas sources. And that's probably the easiest way to do it, quite frankly, from a policy perspective.
Because there's so much resistance against carbon taxing, and at least in the US, that I don't know why, because you could give the money right back to people and it would still do some good, but they don't seem to recognize that. I don't know why not.
Well, people don't recognize a lot of things in the United States.
Oh, this has been such fun and so informative. I can't tell you how grateful I am. I'm going to spread the word as far as possible, and I certainly hope you are doing the same thing. We haven't talked about your current career or your own prospects for what you want to be doing in the future, but you obviously stay very current with what you know.
Yes, I try to.
Thank you so much. It's been wonderful.
Thanks. It's been really nice to do this.
Okay.
Take care.
Bye.